I never should have looked back at him that night. He's just another rich man I can forget by morning. Little did you know, I've been orchestrating every step that led you straight to me. Amara didn't flinch when she slipped out of that penthouse suite in Seoul, believing she'd escaped unscathed from her reckless decision. She flinched weeks later when Park Jisoo emerged from the carefully constructed reality of her everyday world and spoke the words that transformed her independence into an illusion. The first sign came when she noticed her landlord's unusual generosity, followed by her supervisor's sudden kindness, and then the mysterious forgiveness of debts she'd been drowning in. But the truth didn't truly hit until he cornered her in the dim corridor of her own apartment building, his palm pressed flat against the wall beside her face, trapping her with a gaze that held no passion, only absolute certainty. He hadn't been just another wealthy stranger that night. He hadn't been there by chance. And as he leaned closer, his expression carved from stone rather than softened by desire, she finally grasped that their encounter had never been random. She hadn't simply made an error in judgment. She'd walked willingly into a meticulously planned capture far more sophisticated than anything she'd imagined possible. What's up, Afro-Korean Tailies Hub family? Drop a comment below and let me know you're watching. This story is so addictive that if you stop before the end, you'll be tossing and wondering, trying to figure out just how far this man's obsession really runs. Comment below right now if you're ready to discover what happens when a woman who thought she escaped realizes she was captured from the very first moment. Amara Osai walked through Seoul's rain-soaked streets like she owned every inch of concrete beneath her boots. Wrapped in her signature black leather jacket, she felt invincible against whatever the world might throw at her. Anyone watching would see pure self-made confidence, a woman who'd survived and thrived thousands of miles from everything familiar. She fed off the rush of uncertainty, relying on her sharp instincts to handle the rough edges of this massive foreign city. In her own mind, she was beyond anyone's reach, the ruler of her small but fiercely protected kingdom, answerable to absolutely no one. Her existence was built on careful choices and protective walls. She prided herself on her talent for fitting and while standing out simultaneously. Her box braids swung behind her as she entered her go-to late-night haunts. She was convinced she understood how things worked. Grind relentlessly, stay vigilant, and never allow anyone close enough to detect the occasional tremor of fear lurking beneath her confident exterior. Her toughness was her armor, hammered into shape by past struggles that had trained her to brace for impact before the collision even came. To Amara, Seoul was a test she'd already passed, a metropolis where she'd finally discovered the freedom to exist without carrying the burden of other people's demands. She cherished the namelessness of packed streets, how she could vanish into the rhythm of nightlife and resurface stronger when dawn broke. She was the designer of her own fate, or that's what she whispered to herself each time she pulled on that leather jacket and walked into the freezing air. There was authority in her movement, a self-assurance that broadcast she'd weathered the worst storms and emerged intact. She moved with her head high, returning the world's stare with a force that seemed unshakable. In this metropolis of countless souls, she was absolutely certain she controlled the narrative of her own existence, blissfully ignorant that the stage had been constructed long ago for a far more sinister performance. That particular night usually surfaced in Amara's memory as disconnected flashes of amber light and darkness, a feverish hallucination she'd attempted to bury under the routine of ordinary life. It started in an exclusive club hidden in Gangnam's depths, where the atmosphere carried notes of wealth and whispered secrets. She'd arrived to mark a small victory, feeling fearless in her autonomy when everything shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just an intense magnetic force that pulled her attention toward the bar's far end. There sat Park Jisoo, appearing as though he'd stepped directly from a luxury magazine spread into a reality he planned to dominate. When his eyes found hers, those steel-colored irises latched on with such complete focus it stole her breath. He didn't flash a charming grin or deliver a rehearsed pickup line. He simply observed her with a threatening stillness that felt like a dare. As he eventually approached, his imposing shoulders consumed her field of vision, and his cologne, something deep, wooden, and undeniably powerful, coiled around her senses like an invisible rope. She convinced herself she maintained control, that she was simply savoring the excitement of an attractive stranger. But her body told a different story. She experienced that unmistakable sensation in her core, a physical reaction to his nearness that she desperately tried to dismiss. They conversed in hushed voices, his resonant tone cutting through the club's ambient noise, giving weight to each syllable. Amara discovered herself pulled into his orbit, drunk on the deliberate attention he directed her way. He carried himself with predatory elegance, and for the first time in her life, Amara didn't resist being hunted. The attraction between them crackled like electricity, a live current that sparked whenever his fingers grazed hers or his angular face tilted near to murmur in her ear. It was meant to be one night of letting go, a brief escape from her defended existence. She'd melted into his touch, discovering unexpected solace in his solid build and the power he radiated. As darkness blurred into early morning hours, Amara believed she was making an autonomous decision. She assumed she was choosing to lower her defenses for a man who seemed like a shooting star crossing her sky. She had zero awareness that every glance, every caress, every sentence had been a strand in a net he'd begun weaving long before she ever entered those doors. She left thinking she'd lived through a gorgeous fleeting lapse in judgment, never comprehending she'd actually just performed her role in his carefully designed plan. The weeks after, the independence Amara wore like that leather jacket started to feel less like protection and more like a disguise. Seoul, once a landscape she traversed with street-honed survival skills, began reorganizing itself around her in ways that violated logic. It started small, the bizarre coincidences that felt like cracks in her reality. Her crushing student loans, the financial burden that had kept her staring at ceilings in the dark, simply evaporated from the online systems. When she contacted the bank, a courteous representative explained the debt had been cleared by an unnamed private benefactor, leaving her stunned and deeply unsettled. The strangeness intensified at work, where she was abruptly elevated to a position she hadn't even pursued. Her braids felt heavy as she occupied a new glass-enclosed office space, understanding that the parameters of her life had been rewritten without her permission. It transcended money or status. It was the sensation of being curated. Every time she rounded a corner in Seoul's elite neighborhoods, she glimpsed the faintest trace of a black luxury car or a recognizable tailored figure melting into the masses. She was a survivor, and her intelligent instincts screamed that she wasn't merely being observed, she was being orchestrated. A darkness seemed to track her movements, an unseen force that cleared her path even as it tightened invisible restraints around her freedom. When she attempted to settle her restaurant bill, servers would bow and inform her the charges had been covered by an anonymous, regular patron. The resilience she'd taken such pride in began crumbling beneath the pressure of these unwelcome favors. Amara wasn't someone who believed in fantasies. She understood that in Seoul's underground business networks, nothing came free. Her dark eyes scanned the crowds for a face burned into her memory, the man with those metallic gray eyes and sharp features who'd claimed her that night. The flutter in her stomach had morphed into an icy ball of dread. She was supposed to be the architect of her own existence, yet someone was reconstructing the entire building while she remained trapped inside. She felt like an unwilling prisoner in a world she thought she'd mastered, haunted by the understanding that her one-night mistake had merely been the opening scene of a much larger, more frightening production. Amara's false sense of security exploded the instant she heard the distinctive sound of her apartment lock disengaging from outside. She froze in her living space, her hand reflexively gripping her leather jacket's edge as the door swung inward with quiet, horrifying certainty. Park Jisoo didn't bother knocking. He simply walked in, moving with predatory fluidity into territory she'd considered exclusively hers. He bore no resemblance to the man from the club. He appeared as a shadow king, wearing a perfectly fitted black suit that seemed to consume her apartment's dim lighting. His presence was both intrusive and controlled, and the second he crossed her threshold, the oxygen in the room seemed to compress under calculated authority. Amara's intelligent fear ignited as she watched him examine her modest apartment with the composed attention of someone inspecting a valuable purchase. His eyes held no tenderness, only the confidence of a powerful figure accustomed to operating in secrecy. He remained silent initially, his quiet more menacing than any raised voice as he eliminated the space between them in 3 measured steps. Amara retreated, her muscles tensing as her back met the wall, her resilience abandoning her before his imposing frame and threatening composure. This wasn't a lover returning for another encounter. This was a boss reclaiming what he considered his. When he stopped mere inches away, she detected his expensive cologne again, but now the scent communicated ownership rather than romance. Her pulse thundered as he stared down at her, his chiseled jaw set in a line of complete control. She attempted to speak, her lips parting and trembling as she looked up with disbelief. She wanted to demand his explanation for entering, to scream for him to leave, but the words dissolved as he planted one arm on the wall above her, effortlessly caging her without applying any obvious force. In that instant, the flutter in her stomach was replaced by the bone-chilling recognition that her life no longer belonged to her. He stood there, a master strategist who'd stepped from the shadows to finally reveal the true face of the man who'd been controlling her reality. The quiet in the space was oppressive, a tangible force pressing against Amara's ribcage as Park Jisoo eliminated the final gap between them. He moved with predatory grace, his powerful build casting an intimidating shadow across her small living room. Amara's spine connected with the wall's cold surface, her shoulders rigid as she realized retreat was impossible. He didn't hurry. There was nothing emotional in his approach, only a dangerous stillness that raised goosebumps across her skin. He halted just inches from her, close enough that his cologne and the subtle shadow along his jaw became her entire universe. With slow, deliberate motion, he lifted his arm and pressed it against the wall just above her, effortlessly trapping her without physical contact. The black suit he wore seemed to swallow the light, making his piercing stare even more intense as it locked onto her widened eyes. Amara's heart hammered, her parted lips shaking as she fought to maintain some fragment of the toughness she'd worn like armor. She felt the flutter return to her stomach, but twisted now, a dark blend of terror and an unwanted physical response to his calculated dominance. He towered over her, a master manipulator who radiated certainty, his broad shoulders eliminating any possibility of escape. "You're shaking," he observed, his deep voice carrying a subtle Korean accent that sent fresh ice through her bloodstream. Amara raised her chin, her intelligent fear sparking into brief defiance, but the stillness in his posture remained absolute. He didn't appear angry. He looked like someone who'd planned 20 moves ahead and was simply observing the final piece slide into position. In the suffocating closeness of his invasive yet composed stance, she finally grasped that her one-night mistake had been nothing more than an entrance he'd constructed for her to pass through. She was confined in a golden prison of his design, and as he leaned nearer, the space between them disappeared, leaving only the chilling awareness that her freedom had always been a mirage. Jisoo didn't lower his arm from the wall, maintaining Amara within the small, stifling space his body created. Instead, he reached into his suit's inner pocket with his free hand, extracting a thick cream-colored envelope that seemed out of place in her humble apartment. He placed it on the nearby table, the sound of heavy paper meeting wood reverberating like a judge's hammer. His expression stayed intense and impenetrable, his eyes never abandoning her face as he indicated she should look. With shaking hands, Amara grabbed the envelope, her intelligent fear warning her to stop. Inside was documentation that systematically destroyed her belief in her own autonomy. She discovered copies of her apartment's ownership papers, transferred months earlier to a corporation she now recognized as his. There were records of her vanished student debt and internal company memoranda from her workplace, authorized by executives who answered to him. The documents were the chains she hadn't known she wore, a carefully assembled record of possession rather than romance. "You believed your life was a string of fortunate breaks, Amara," he stated, his deep voice low and carrying that slight accent that made her pulse race. "You thought you were thriving on your own strength." He leaned closer, his angular jaw nearly brushing her temple as he looked down at the proof of his calculated authority. Every bizarre coincidence was exposed in ink and seals. Every advancement, every cleared debt was a link in a cage he'd constructed around her long before they'd shared a bed. Amara felt reality fracture, a wave of disbelief crashing over her as she understood her one-night mistake was simply the instant she'd finally entered the trap he'd finished preparing months before. She wasn't a survivor who'd managed to flourish in Seoul. She was a prized possession who'd been carefully cultivated by a master strategist. The resilience she felt in her leather jacket evaporated, replaced by the horrifying realization that she'd been claimed for something far more terrifying than romance. She looked up at him, fear mingling with disbelief, understanding that in his world there were no accidents, only results he already controlled. Amara shoved the papers toward his chest, the rustle of expensive paper sounding like desperate resistance in the silent room. She forced a laugh, though it emerged rough and fragile. Her intelligent fear remained, but her resilience was fighting its way back to the surface. She met his intense stare directly, refusing to become just another asset on his spreadsheet. "So that's your game," she snapped, her voice strengthening as she channeled her inner fighter. "A corporate takeover. You're not human, Jisoo. You're a machine. Everything is so precisely planned with you. Do you ever do anything spontaneous, or is your entire existence just one massive cold strategy because you're terrified of something you can't manipulate?" She anticipated irritation, perhaps a tightening of his jaw. But Jisoo remained disturbingly motionless. His dangerous calm didn't falter. It intensified. He leaned even closer, the warmth from his solid frame radiating through her leather jacket, forcing her to recognize how insignificant she truly was in his shadow. "Control isn't fear, Amara," he whispered, his deep voice resonating through her very core. "It's the only currency this world recognizes." He reached out, not to harm, but to tuck a loose braid behind her ear. The gesture was terrifyingly tender, his piercing eyes locking onto hers with an iron determination that made her mockery feel like pebbles thrown at a fortress. In that gaze, she witnessed the Shadow King who'd survived conflicts she couldn't fathom. He wasn't playing games. He was defining the reality she inhabited. "You think your insults wound me because they're clever," he continued, his thumb grazing her jawline with the composed focus of a predator who'd already triumphed. "But you're still waging a war that concluded months ago. I didn't anticipate your resistance, Amara." "I anticipated your arrival, and as you can observe, you're precisely where I designed you to be." The oxygen left her chest. Her attempt to provoke him had only validated his point. He wasn't someone who could be swayed by petty defiance. He was an unstoppable force in a tailored suit, and his piercing stare conveyed that regardless of her struggle, she was already woven into his design. Her shoulders dropped slightly, the weight of his absolute conviction finally beginning to crack her spirit. Jisoo's hand fell from the wall, but his presence didn't withdraw. He turned partially, gazing out the window at Seoul's sprawling neon arteries, his profile sharp and unreadable against the glass. "You think my strategy was an exercise in ego, Amara," he said, his voice descending to a register that felt like a threat. "You think you were a free woman navigating these streets safely because of your own street intelligence, but you were never walking unguarded." He rotated back toward her, his piercing eyes reflecting a harsh, undeniable truth. "Do you recall that night at the club? You didn't register the 3 men in the corner booth. Kim Taewon's operatives. They weren't there for entertainment. They were there to send a brutal message to your father's creditors. They identified a vulnerable woman with no protection, perfect leverage to be seized, exploited, and disposed of." Amara's parted lips released a shallow breath as the disbelief in her eyes intensified. She remembered those men now, the weight of their shoulders, how the atmosphere had felt dangerous near their table. "They tracked you to the subway station," Jisoo continued, his dangerous calm deepening. "They were 10 steps behind when my vehicle intercepted." "That night wasn't an accident, Amara. It was a rescue operation. I didn't randomly appear at that club. I blocked an attack. Every debt I eliminated, every promotion I arranged, every shadow that tracked you, it wasn't solely to claim you. It was to construct a barrier around you that Taewon's people couldn't penetrate." He stepped back into her space, his powerful frame again blocking the light. "In this city, someone always controls the territory. If my strategy wasn't keeping you alive, you would have discovered the cost of survival from men who don't use silk restraints or designer suits. They use bullets and unmarked graves." Amara felt a cold tremor ripple beneath her leather jacket. The resilience she'd clung to felt like cardboard armor in a hurricane. She'd spent months believing she was outsmarting the world, never realizing she was the trophy in a war between predators. Jisoo wasn't just her captor. He was the apex predator that had eliminated all the other threats. "So," he whispered, his jaw tightening as he watched the intelligent fear finally transform into grim comprehension. "Would you prefer to be free in a world determined to destroy you, or protected in a world that answers to me?" Amara turned from Jisoo, her footsteps soundless on the soft carpet as she approached the floor-to-ceiling windows. Seoul's glittering skyline extended before her, a vast ocean of electric blues and neon purples resembling a circuit board of power and hidden agendas. For months, she'd observed those lights and felt like a conqueror, a woman who'd successfully built a life in the heart of a foreign metropolis. Now the view felt transformed. Each illuminated skyscraper, each shifting light on the Han River was a testament to the enormity of the world he commanded. She sensed Jisoo's powerful frame move up behind her. Though he didn't make contact, his presence was a dangerous stillness that saturated the room. More solid than the glass, separating her from the drop below. Amara studied her reflection in the window, her black leather jacket now appearing less like armor and more like a memento of a woman who no longer existed. She wasn't an outsider in this city anymore. She wasn't an anonymous survivor drifting through crowds. She was a claimed component of the infrastructure, a central character in a narrative authored by the man standing in the shadows behind her. "The city transforms when you understand who controls the air you breathe, doesn't it?" Jisoo's deep voice was a low vibration that seemed to synchronize with the city's pulse. Amara didn't respond immediately. She observed the reflection of his intense stare as it locked onto hers through the glass. The intelligent fear persisted, but it was being overtaken by a heavy, glittering acceptance. The chains he'd fastened on her weren't forged from metal. They were constructed from security, obligation, and a calculated obsession she could no longer reject. She recognized that exiting this room wouldn't equal freedom. It would mean stepping back into the crosshairs of the enemies he'd spent months protecting her from. Her parted lips released a slow, measured breath that fogged the glass. She was no longer the designer of her own life. But there was a dark, electrifying thrill in knowing she was the only thing in this entire sparkling skyline that a man like Park Jisoo genuinely wanted to possess. As he finally positioned a hand on the window beside her face, boxing her in one final time against the panorama of his empire, Amara closed her eyes. She'd been captured in a gilded trap, and for the first time since arriving in Seoul, she stopped searching for the way out. She was exactly where he had engineered her to be. If you enjoyed this romantic, emotional story, why not subscribe, share to friends and loved ones? I will see you in the next interesting one.